Biloxi, Mississippi. A quiet southern town with a burning core of corruption. In 1987, its secret burst violently to the surface, leaving 2 prominent citizens dead and ripping the top off a grand conspiracy.
On Mississippi's Gulf Coast, a judge and his politician wife are murdered in their home. The killer left few clues. It looked like a professional hit, and the investigation led nowhere. But the FBI refused to give up. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Until we could prove that federal laws had been broken, our hands were tied. It would take years to break the conspiracy of silence and reveal the tangled tale of corruption.
Biloxi, Mississippi. Monday, September 14th, 1987. It was a typically warm summer night in this quiet Gulf Coast town. The workday was over, and most residents had retreated to the tranquility of their homes. Like most of their neighbors, State Circuit Court Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife Margaret were unwinding after a long day. Vincent Sherry was a prominent judge in Biloxi. Margaret was making plans to run for mayor. Both were fixtures at Biloxi's social and community functions. They were a happy couple who had raised 3 grown children. Tomorrow they planned to visit their daughter out of state. Their life together seemed ideal. They were just settling in for the night when an unexpected visitor came to the door.
What are you doing here with that?
And brought their perfect world to an end. The Sherrys were supposed to be with their daughter, so no one realized anything was wrong until 2 days later when the judge failed to show up in court on Wednesday, September 16th. Calls to the Sherrys' home went unanswered.
I'm sorry we can't take your call, but leave your message after the beep.
His colleagues at the court phoned Pete Halat, Vincent Sherry's friend and former law partner.
Morning, Pete Halat.
But he hadn't seen or heard from the judge either.
Well, he's supposed to be in court.
When did he leave?
I don't know.
All right, I'll send
No,
somebody
wait,
out to
you let me call him at home and I'll figure out where he is.
All right.
After he left a concerned message on the Sherry's answering machine, Halat felt he'd better check on his friend personally.
Oh, I got the machine. Judge, it's Pete. They're looking for you in court. Is everything okay?
On his way out, he asked his junior partner, Charles Legier, to ride with him.
Charlie, hold on, time to settle up. I need some help, so let's go.
Listen, I'll give you a call back, okay? Yeah, bye-bye.
I figure if we go together, the two of us will fine.
As they drove, Legier tried to make conversation.
Finding out from lawyers,
Halat seemed distant perhaps concerned about the judge. Both of the Sherry's cars stood in the driveway.
Well, the car's here.
I don't like it. Well, his car's here. He's supposed to be in court.
Halat asked Legier to go to the house, while he asked a neighbor if she'd seen the couple.
Just go ahead.
Legier rang the doorbell, but no one answered. He saw that the last 2 morning newspapers hadn't been picked up.
Pete Halat. I'm a partner.
The neighbor told Halat she hadn't seen the Sherrys for a couple of days, which she thought was odd since both of their cars were in the driveway. When Legier tried the Sherry's door, he found it unlocked. Something wasn't right.
Hey, Pete! Pete!
That's unusual.
Yeah, I was just knocking on it and the door opened up.
Halat, concerned by the open door, cautiously stepped inside. A few steps in, he made the gruesome discovery. Judge Sherry had been gunned down in his own home.
What's wrong?
They called the police. Authorities arrived to find the body of Vincent Sherry at the front of the house. In the back bedroom, they discovered Margaret. Because the couple was so prominent, the murder investigation became top priority. Detectives contacted the FBI's Biloxi field office. Though the FBI would not yet be officially involved, they offered the use of their agents and forensic laboratory. Inside, the police began scouring the crime scene for clues. They conducted blood spatter analysis to determine projectile angles. If they could figure out where the murderer had stood when he fired the shots, they might be able to reconstruct the crime.
Okay.
Inspector Robert Burris, a crime technician with the Biloxi Police Department, helped process the scene. He discovered a possible clue in the den.
There was blood trailing from his feet, actually going down between his legs a little ways, back to where he was laying. There was blood spatter on a double sliding glass door that was right beyond his head. And further examination in this room, I found some small pieces of foam rubber.
Burris didn't see where the foam rubber could have come from.
3 shell casings, you want to get those?
A search of the house led him to one conclusion.
Now this foam rubber had to have been brought into the house. We examined every piece of material in this house, in every room of the house, all pillows, mattresses, everything else. There's no foam rubber tore up in this house. It was brought into the house. It does have gunshot residue on it. And basically about the only way it can get there is for a bullet to be fired through it.
For Burris, the significance of the foam rubber was obvious. The killer had used a homemade silencer. Investigators dusted for fingerprints, but found none of any value. They found 9 spent .22 caliber shell casings from a semi-automatic pistol, as well as the bullets used to murder the Sherrys. The position of the shells indicated that the shots had been fired in rapid succession. But most striking was how well the killer had covered his tracks. Nothing at the scene pointed to the killer's identity. He did his job well, and his mission was clear.
The lack of evidence in this house, such as items stolen, a struggle occurring, the absence of forced entry, no ransacking going on in the house whatsoever. A person came there for one thing, that was to kill the two Sherrys.
Special Agent Keith Bell from the Biloxi FBI field office agreed that this was a professional job. The Sherrys had been assassinated.
The crime scene appeared to be very limited as far as evidence remaining, which meant it was well planned, well executed, and professionally done. A small caliber weapon had been used. The foam rubber indicated that perhaps a silencer had also been used, and the Sherrys had been shot in the head, so it seemed to be a very professional job.
A multi-agency task force was assembled with Special Agent Keith Bell among its members. Investigators would spend days processing the crime scene. They grappled with a single question: why had the Sherrys been murdered?
That was one of the main questions, that being why were both Judge Sherry and Margaret Sherry murdered? Because it was fairly obvious that Judge Sherry could have been killed during his morning or afternoon jogs around the neighborhood. So it was a real mystery why Margaret had been killed.
Investigators believed the answer might lie in the controversy over Biloxi's future. Some civic leaders hoped to transform the sleepy southern town on Mississippi's Gulf Coast into a flashy resort where casinos would attract tourist dollars. But with strip clubs already established in town, Margaret Sherry felt Biloxi's small-town charms were threatened. And the casinos would attract a criminal element. As a candidate for mayor, she had made powerful political enemies by trying to keep gambling out. Agent Bell wondered if Margaret was killed to silence her protests.
Margaret had been so outspoken politically in the community. She was known to be anti-gambling. And if elected mayor in 1989, she had planned to close down the remaining strip clubs in Biloxi. So there was always the possibility that she might have been the target, rather than Judge Sherry.
The task force would investigate Margaret's political enemies, but first, they'd question the Sherrys' friends and neighbors. Someone in the neighborhood must have seen something. But even people who'd known the Sherrys for years were reluctant to talk, fearing the specter of Biloxi's emerging criminal underworld.
The Sherry murders brought a dark cloud over the city of Biloxi. Many of the citizens in Biloxi were afraid to openly express their opinions. They saw that Margaret Sherry, who had been quite vocal and quite outspoken in political circles, had ended up dead, as had her prominent husband, Judge Sherry. So many citizens after these murders were hesitant even to be interviewed by FBI agents or by local police officers because they basically did not want their names tied into anything to do with this case.
If people wouldn't talk to the authorities, perhaps they would talk to Lynn Sposito, the Sherry's daughter. After being notified of her parents' murders, Lynn rushed to Biloxi from her home in North Carolina. Determined to find justice, she questioned everyone in the neighborhood. One family friend gave her a crucial piece of information. He described a suspicious car and driver in the neighborhood on the night of the murders. She took the lead to the police.
They identified a man who had seen a suspicious Ford Fairmont driving in front of the Sherry home on Monday night, September 14th, 1987.
Investigators tried to determine the identity of the driver based on the witness's description. Their search came up empty. But a few days later, not far from the Sherry's home, investigators found an abandoned car, a Ford Fairmont. A check on the vehicle's identification number showed it had been reported stolen the day before the murders. Police also learned that the tags on the car were not registered to the car. Realizing that this vehicle was probably the killer's getaway car, investigators towed it to a police garage to examine it further. Somewhere in the car, they hoped to find a key to the killer's identity. Less than a week after the brutal murders of Biloxi couple Vince and Margaret Sherry, investigators received their first promising lead. They recovered an abandoned car, matching the one witnesses described seeing the night of the murders. After contacting Agent Keith Bell about the discovery, investigators processed the car for clues. Inspector Robert Burris found something peculiar.
I was processing this vehicle, and one of the things I noted, the dome light had been dismantled and the bulb taken out of it. In other words, if you open the door, you ain't got no light. Both of the sun visors were in the down position. Whether you're riding around daytime or nighttime, you ain't gonna be able to see the people's face in it very well.
Investigators believed more than ever that this was the car used by the Sherry's killer. Anything found inside it was labeled, packaged, and shipped to the FBI labs in Washington, D.C. But FBI lab examiners would find nothing of evidentiary value. After Agent Bell arrived, he examined the license tag more closely. He discovered it had its own story to tell.
It was determined that the tag on the Ford Fairmont had been stolen from an abandoned vehicle in 1984, actually 3 years before these murders occurred. So what it meant was someone had removed the license plate, likely in 1984, had kept the license plate, and then when this major crime in the city of Biloxi was to occur, they pulled it off the shelf, so to speak.
With no other solid evidence, investigators hoped that following the trail of the stolen tag might lead to the killer. It was traced to an apartment complex where the original car had been abandoned 3 years earlier. Investigators contacted the apartment manager, who told them that prior to having the vehicle towed, he called a friend to come and strip it for parts. The manager's friend was a man that agents knew by name and reputation. Biloxi locksmith Lenny Sweatman. He was the last person to be seen near the car. Sweatman belonged to a loosely organized group of criminals the FBI was investigating in connection with another case. The group was known as the DIXIE Mafia. FBI agent Keith Bell had connected the car used in the Sherry killings to Lenny Sweatman. Now, Bell wondered if the DIXIE Mafia was linked to the Sherry murders. If Sweatman had a part in it, Bell believed that other DIXIE Mafia members couldn't be far behind. He began looking into Sweatman's associates.
What that meant to us immediately, those of us familiar with the criminal associations on the coast, was that if Lenny Sweatman was involved in getting the tag for the hit car, then quite likely his close personal friend and longtime associate Mike Gillich, the strip club owner in Biloxi, might also be involved in these murders.
That's all right.
Sometimes you know how it is. Oh, thanks.
Oh, beer.
All right.
Gillich, who owned 3 strip clubs in Biloxi, was well known to local law enforcement. He was currently under investigation by the FBI in connection with a DIXIE Mafia operation known as the Lonely Heart Scam.
See, he gets to him.
But Special Agent Bell needed a thread that connected the two investigations together. He started by familiarizing himself with the Lonely Heart scam. It was run out of Angola prison in Louisiana by a man named Kirksey Nix, the incarcerated kingpin of the DIXIE Mafia.
No, the first model.
Nix would run ads in gay magazines, asking for money to help fictional gay men get out of trouble with the law. Through the scam, Nix was hoping to generate enough money to solve his own legal problems. He was serving a life sentence for murder.
From his jail cell at Angola, he coordinated what we've been referring to as the homosexual scam, which generated hundreds of thousands of dollars from individuals around the country, as well as some people in Canada. With this money, he intended to buy his way out, or attempt to buy his way out, of his Louisiana prison sentence.
Believing that they were helping gay men out of trouble, people who read the magazine ads would wire or mail money to a nearby Western Union. Nix would then call his contact on the outside, Mike Gillich. Gillich would then dispatch his bagman to retrieve the money.
Right. See you later.
Gillich made sure that the scam money was distributed to DIXIE Mafia members and safely stashed away for Kirksey Nix.
Take care.
In the coming months, investigators developed more evidence in the Lonely Heart scam, but still had no direct link between these conspirators and the Sherry's killers. A year into the investigation, the murder case threatened to stall.
Hi. Come in.
As the year stretched to 16 months, the Sherry's daughter, Lynn Sposito, grew increasingly frustrated. In January 1989, she hired a private investigator to rev up the inquest into her parents' murder.
He said he could make out the man.
And I'll give him a call, and I'll be on this case this afternoon.
The family had wanted very much to have a quick resolution to the case, but by early 1989, there'd still been no arrest. And of course, at this point, the FBI had not formally entered the case.
Nice to see you. Thank you for seeing
The lack of official FBI involvement hampered Bell's investigation. So when the private investigator paid him a visit, Bell welcomed his assistants, hoping they could share information. The two were old acquaintances from the private investigator's days in law enforcement. Since Agent Bell was unable to act officially, the private investigator would pursue a lead that looked promising. He would interview another Angola inmate. The private investigator and Bell hoped the inmate at Angola could finally link the Lonely Heart scam and the Sherry murders.
He met with all the right people, and because of his knowledge of the DIXIE Mafia and from what he had learned from law enforcement authorities on the coast, he did go over to Angola and did talk to the right person over there.
The inmate's name was Bobby Joe Fabian. He was another known member of the DIXIE Mafia, doing time for kidnapping and shooting a state trooper. Fabian claimed he had not been involved in the Sherry murders, but he had learned that fellow inmate Kirksey Nix had been. Fabian told the private investigator that Nix had had Judge Sherry killed because Sherry had allegedly stolen money from Nix's Lonely Heart scam. That wasn't all. He said Nix had been told of the theft by none other than Pete Halat, Sherry's former law partner. Halat, the man who had delivered the eulogy at the Sherry's funeral, was now implicated in their murders. Halat officially represented Nix on legal matters, but Fabian said Halat's role in the Lonely Heart scam was criminal, not legal. Halat was one of the people receiving money from Nix for safekeeping through Mike Gillich's bagman.
Don't forget to pick up next week at the other place.
And the ties between the outlaw and the lawyer went deep. Kirksey Nix's girlfriend and accomplice, LaRae Sharp, worked in Halat's office.
Where's he from?
Fabian said both LaRae Sharp and Pete Halat were stashing money from the scam in a safe deposit box for Kirksey Nix. And he said the amount had reached 6 figures. Thanks to Fabian, the link between the murders and the Lonely Heart scam had been made. And not only had Fabian given investigators a possible motive for the killings, he was also able to supply the name of the alleged hitman, an ex-con named John Ransom, who was believed to be living in Georgia. But tracking down Ransom would take time.
Anytime law enforcement people get together and start talking about notorious Dixie Mafia members, John Ransom comes up quite early in the conversation. He's a longtime alleged hitman for the Dixie Mafia.
In August of 1989, 2 years after the Sherry murders, Agent Bell now had enough evidence to warrant a full FBI investigation into the killings. Accompanied by the Sherry's daughter, Lynn Sposito, he approached the United States Attorney and the FBI with a demand to officially open the case.
So with the tying in of the scam to the murders, we knew we had some federal violations involved. We have wire fraud, we had mail fraud, and we perhaps had a hitman traveling from Georgia to Mississippi to kill the Sherrys. It was decided to open an official FBI investigation and join with local authorities in the investigation.
By now, however, suspect Pete Halat, Judge Sherry's former law partner, had been elected mayor of Biloxi. With a key suspect in such a high position, investigators encountered new roadblocks.
It became very difficult for the FBI to share all of its information with the local authorities. We are not saying that the local police were corrupt. What we are saying is that Mayor Halat put his own people in as Director of Public Safety and as Police Chief, so we were somewhat circumspect on what we shared with local authorities during that time period.
In August of 1989, as investigators attempted to unravel the truth about the Sherry's murders, informant Bobby Joe Fabian made a surprise move. He told his story about the Sherry murders to the TV news. Fabian hoped that by bringing attention to himself, Kirksey Nix would be less likely to have him killed for cooperating with authorities. Along with the report, the station broadcast a mugshot of John Ransom, the alleged hitman in the Sherry case. When Charles Legier, Pete Halat's junior partner, saw the photo, it surprised him. He recalled seeing Ransom outside the Sherry Halat law offices a few weeks before the murders. Legier shared his information with the task force. Major Randy Cook of the Harrison County Sheriff's Department took Legier's statement.
Legier said the reason he remembered Ransom was Ransom stepped off of a curb and came up to him and asked him where's Vince Sherry's office at. When Legier was interviewed, he recalled there was something unusual about the way Ransom stepped off of the curb. Ransom had a prosthesis on one leg.
Investigators learned that Ransom was now in a Georgia prison, serving time for another murder. When questioned about the Sherry murders, he refused to cooperate. As Cook further questioned Legier about the day he and Halat had found the bodies, an important detail emerged. Legier remembered that Halat had walked into the Sherry's living room, seen Judge Sherry's body, and said, "Vince and Margaret are dead." Cook relayed this to Agent Bell.
What was interesting was that Margaret's body was in the far back bedroom of the residence, and according to Chuck Legier, Pete Halat did not have time other than to briefly enter the front of the house and would have no way of knowing that Margaret's body was also in the very back bedroom.
In October of 1989, 2 years after the murders, Agent Bell knew Halat was involved, but he still lacked enough evidence for an arrest. Even so, he felt it was time to confront Mayor Halat. It would be a quiet warning, man to man.
And I let Mayor Halat know that I thought his knowledge of the Sherry murders was much greater than what he had shared with law enforcement authorities up to that point. And I recall also telling him that the FBI would continue working on this case until it was totally solved. My recollection is he smiled and did not have much else to say.
As a lawyer, Halat knew Bell would need more concrete evidence in order to secure a conviction. What he likely didn't realize was the depth of Bell's commitment to bring him to justice. Three years had passed since Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife Margaret were murdered in their Biloxi, Mississippi home. FBI Special Agent Keith Bell had connected the killings to members of the DIXIE Mafia and to Judge Sherry's friend and one-time law partner, Pete Halat. The alleged triggerman, John Ransom, was refusing to talk. In January of 1990, Agent Bell and Major Randy Cook of the Harrison County Sheriff's Department drove to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary to question another possible accomplice.
This is Special Agent.
A man named Bill Rhodes. Rhodes, a known associate of John Ransom, was willing to cooperate. He told them that in early 1987, Ransom had contacted him about driving the getaway car in a crime to take place in southern Mississippi. Ransom had said a judge would be murdered and that the pay was $10,000.
There were certain promises made to Rhodes by Ransom that I know certain people in Biloxi that if you'll help me on this and you'll have the run of Biloxi anytime you want it.
So in March of 1987, Rhodes went to Biloxi and met with Ransom and a man named Pete. It was Pete who specifically asked Rhodes and Ransom to do the hit. Rhodes said he also met with Mike Gillich, the Biloxi strip club owner, who would supply the money once the hit was done. But 5 months later, before they could do the job, Rhodes was arrested on an unrelated bank robbery charge, and Ransom got cold feet, afraid Rhodes would turn on him. The information helped the case inch forward, but Agent Bell and Officer Cook still felt that Ransom held the missing pieces. Another year would pass without much progress. In late 1990, the investigators went to the Bostick Correctional Institute in Georgia, where Ransom was serving time. Finally, Ransom agreed to talk. He admitted that he delivered a .22 caliber pistol to LaRae Sharp, Kirksey Nix's girlfriend. But Ransom insisted that he did not do the job. Based on what Ransom said, LaRae's involvement was starting to look bigger than simply stashing scam money in a safe deposit box.
All finished?
Finished, thank you.
Through his contact with Sharp, Nix learned that the investigation was heating up He worried that his girlfriend might talk, so he tried to head off the problem by putting out a contract on her life. But in late 1990, Agent Bell arrested her for her participation in the murders, inadvertently saving her from Nix's gunman. During a polygraph test, Sharp denied her involvement in the Lonely Heart scam and the Sherry murders. But the machine called her bluff. When Bell and his team added her statements to their existing stacks of evidence, they were ready to bring indictments against several key players. Mike Gillich, John Ransom, LaRae Sharp, and Kirksey Nix were charged as conspirators in the Sherry murders. Notably missing from the list was Pete Halat. The case against Halat would have to wait until they had enough evidence for a murder conviction. For now, the FBI would look to convict the others on conspiracy to commit murder.
So many of the questions came up, why didn't y'all indict Pete Halat early on when you indicted everybody else? Well, at the time, we didn't have the hard evidence that you would have to arrest a mayor and prosecute him.
The conspiracy trial produced several key witnesses that would help investigators piece together the complex scheme.
Mr. Gant, you stated that all these people here murdered.
Robbie Gant, Gillich's bagman for the Lonely Heart scam, testified for the prosecution. His testimony helped prosecutors link the Sherry murders to the scam. All 4 defendants were found guilty. Nix was given 15 years in addition to the life sentence he was already serving for murder. Gillich also received a 15-year prison term. Ransom got 10 years, and LaRae Sharp 1.
I pay you for it. Get your hands in order in the court.
With these conspirators behind bars and the Lonely Heart scam no longer operational, Bell moved on to his next objective.
We decided not to end the Sherry investigation after the 1991 initial convictions because at that time we had not proven who had actually shot the Sherrys, and also Pete Halat had not been indicted or convicted at that point. And we all felt strongly that Pete Halat had played a major role in the scam and in the murder plot. So we were determined to continue the investigation to see if we could get enough evidence to indict and convict Mr. Halat and the actual shooter.
In late July of 1992, Agent Bell got the break he was looking for. Following the conspiracy trial, Mike Gillich was desperate to find a way out of prison. He contacted one of his associates in Biloxi and asked him to approach Robbie Gant with an offer.
Okay, well, whatever you say.
Gant told Agent Bell about it.
And the associate had offered Robbie Gant $20,000 if Gant would recant his testimony against Gillich and sign a false affidavit stating that he had been threatened by me to testify against Gillich, to testify falsely against Gillich.
Gant agreed to wear a wire and get the offer from Gillich's accomplice on tape. Gant met with him in Mississippi. This time, Gant's tape was rolling when Gillich's associate reiterated the bribe. Gant accepted as Bell had instructed. Now, Bell had the evidence he needed to turn up the heat on Gillich. Just the man who could tell the story from the inside. By 1993, 6 years after the double murder of Vince and Margaret Sherry, FBI agent Keith Bell had put 4 members of the DIXIE Mafia behind bars. But he still had no formal murder convictions against those involved. And Mayor Pete Halat, the suspected mastermind of the case, was still free and running the city of Biloxi. In fact, the year before, Mayor Halat had broken ground on the city's first big casino.
The victory for our town and our people.
The press still hounded Halat about his involvement in the Sherry murders, but he remained adamant about his innocence. Bell continued to work his plan. He used the bribe Robert Gant had recorded on tape to level another charge against Mike Gillich, already in jail. Now Bell indicted Gillich for witness bribery and witness tampering for trying to buy off Gant. And that did the trick.
No doubt the most important turning point was in October of 1993 when Mike Gillich finally decided to cooperate and tell the story of this whole case from an insider's point of view. And that's what really allowed us to bring final resolution to this investigation.
After the years of painstaking work Bell had spent on the case, it was a satisfying moment. Finally, it seemed his patience and ingenuity were paying off. Gillich was in no hurry to accrue more jail time. Bell's relentless pressure had persuaded him to cut a deal before the bribery trial even began. The DIXIE Mafia member would tell what he knew about the murders. Maybe now, Bell could get the convictions he knew were long overdue. But for a career criminal like Mike Gillich, adjusting to life on the right side of the law wasn't easy. At first, he tried to bluff his way out.
Of course, it always takes some time, a period of weeks, to develop some degree of trust and to be able to communicate with someone like this who, for the first time, has decided to leave his lifelong role as a criminal and start cooperating with the FBI.
When deception didn't work, Gillich had no alternative. He had to tell the truth. Now, for the first time, Bell heard the story from an inside source. Gillich knew all the details.
Mike was the center point. Mike knew Kirksey Nix. Mike knew Pete Halat for years. And in fact, when Kirksey Nix was looking for an attorney over in the coast area to represent him on various matters, Mike Gillich introduced Nix into Pete Halat.
He confirmed that Pete Halat was indeed behind the plan to murder the Sherrys, and that the plot grew directly out of the Lonely Heart scam of Angola prison inmate Kirksey Nix. Some months before the Sherrys' deaths, Halat had closed the safe deposit box he and Nix's girlfriend LaRae Sharp had access to, effectively cutting off her access to the money. He then transferred the money into a box only he and Judge Sherry could use. Motivated by greed, he stole $100,000 cash from there. As Nix's trusted accomplice, Halat could blame the theft on Judge Sherry. Next, he went to Mike Gillich with news of the theft.
Mr. Gillich stated that Pete Halat approached Mr. Gillich himself in late 1986 and told Mr. Gillich that much of the money was missing, supposedly around $100,000. and Mr. Allat blamed Judge Sherry for taking the money. Mr. Allat knew that Kirksey Nix would be very furious about this.
It is not known who ordered Margaret's death, but as a fierce opponent of corruption, she posed a threat to the underworld forces hoping to control Biloxi. With Margaret dead, Allat could be free to run the town.
I got the contacts. I've already kind of started the ball too.
Gillett said that he and Allat planned the murders. Ransom and Rhodes provided the murder weapon. But when they passed on doing the hit, Gillett found a replacement. A Texas-based petty criminal named Thomas Holcomb. Holcomb would be paid $20,000 to murder Judge Sherry and his wife. Gillett had also helped provide the car with the help of locksmith Lenny Sweatman. In October of 1996, agents arrested hitman Thomas Holcomb in Texas on murder charges. That same month also saw the arrest that Agent Bell had anticipated and worked 9 years to achieve.
I'm an innocent man, and you're going to put the cuffs on me?
Let me read you your rights.
The arrest of Pete Allat for the murders of the Sherrys.
You can, anything you say can and will be held against you.
Kirksey Nix and LaRae Sharp were indicted on 52 counts, including fraud, money laundering, and murder. Allat was tried and convicted in the summer of 1997, a full decade after the crimes were committed. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Also tried and convicted were Kirksey Nix and Thomas Holcomb, the hitman. Both were sentenced to life. LaRae Sharp, Nix's girlfriend, got 5 years.
I think a lot of citizens in Biloxi now realize that there are a lot of dedicated professional law enforcement people who will do everything they can to protect the community and work hard to solve major crimes. Perhaps the legacy, you might say, of the case for the criminal element is that they realize after seeing this case that they can commit a crime one day and think they're getting away with it a year later, but it could come back 10 years later and get them.
While the Sherry's killers were finally brought to justice, Margaret Sherry's dream of a Biloxi free of gambling was never realized. Instead, Biloxi has become a resort town filled with casinos and neon lights. The sleepy southern town is gone forever, along with the woman who lost her life trying to save it. New York City's Mafia, an organization of brutal gangs. To gain wealth and power, members strong-arm businesses and kill anyone in their way. John Gotti was one of organized crime's fiercest members. He wanted to rule New York City. The FBI had to stop him.
John Gotti was ambitious, powerful, and ruthless. He ruled with flash and conspicuous style, playing celebrity with the media and cat and mouse with the FBI. They called John Gotti the Teflon Don. Serious charges just wouldn't stick. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. When John Gotti came to power in 1985, organized crime still had its tentacles spread into many legitimate businesses. Like a game of chess, crime bosses were well insulated by layers of pawns. The FBI's job was to penetrate their defenses and capture the king.
New York is the home of organized crime in America. Through intimidation, terror, and murder, the 5 families that make up New York's Mafia have corrupted labor unions, run extortion rackets, and infiltrated almost every major industry in the city. Disputes among the crime families often erupt over who controls which union or what industry. These disputes are inevitably and violently resolved. By the 1970s, the Gambino family had emerged as the most violent and the most powerful crime family in the nation. As that decade came to an end, the FBI decided it was time to stop the Mafia's reign of terror. The Bureau's New York office set up 5 squads assigned to investigate and bring down each criminal family. Special Agent Bruce Mao was assigned to supervise the squad responsible for bringing down the Gambino family.
The Bureau realized that we really weren't addressing organized crime here in New York, and so they formed squads to target each particular crime family and try to address the organized crime problem here in New York. So in 1980 we formed the squad, and our target was to put the Gambino family in jail.
The main targets of Mao's investigation were the leaders of the Gambino family. The boss, Paul Castellano, and his underboss, Neil Della Croce. Castellano assumed leadership of the family in 1976, when Carlos Gambino, the namesake of the family, died of natural causes. The FBI were also targeting the most powerful captains in the family, like John Gotti. The captains controlled crews of soldiers who carried out the day-to-day criminal activity for the family. Castellano's crews would commit the actual crimes, but Castellano himself did not. Catching him seemed impossible. As the FBI soon learned, the entire hierarchy of the Gambino family was well insulated. The family army consisted of over 50 captains who controlled over 300 soldiers. It was a large and impenetrable secret society, accessible to outsiders only through the lenses of surveillance cameras. But federal racketeering legislation was passed that made ordering criminal acts as much of a crime as committing the crime itself. In order to successfully prosecute the hierarchy of the Gambino family, the FBI had to secretly get them on tape discussing their criminal enterprise. Mao and his team would have to patiently and methodically work their way into the intricate structure of the Gambino family. It would take years to accomplish that goal. Agents tried to learn more by speaking to residents in the neighborhoods where mob activity was prevalent.
You sure now? Yeah. But take a look. You might recognize one of these guys. Take a look. Take a good look. Take your time.
Few people were willing to talk. Only those on the inside could tell agents who were the real power brokers in the family. Cooperating witnesses and informants had to be developed. Betraying the Mafia meant certain death. Informants would be difficult to come by. But some were willing to take the risk. Most were low-level criminals cutting deals with the government to avoid prosecution and long prison sentences. Whatever their motivation, they gave agents something they did not have before: a back door into the Gambino family's criminal operations.
Where's this computer?
Castellano ran the family like a major corporation. Nicknamed within the Mafia as the Pope, he used unions to strengthen his grip on various industries in New York. Louis Schilero, head of the FBI's New York office, is an expert on organized crime.
One of the most influential things that the Gambino family did was the control of the labor unions in New York City. They exerted at one time tremendous influence in terms of the Longshoremen's Union, in terms of construction industry trade unions, and in terms of the Teamsters and trucking. By controlling the trade unions in New York City, the Gambino family was able to control construction and certainly had a great influence in the garment center. And that generated tremendous amount of financial base to the family.
You know, that's paper trail.
Castellano knew how to keep his interests under control.
Castellano also realized how important it was to rule by fear and terror, so he had several enforcement arms of the family. He had a crew that was famous for killing people, dismembering bodies, and doing all sorts of horrid things. So even though Castellano was known as a businessman's Don, he was a tough guy. He had a hair trigger and temper, and he'd kill you at the drop of a hat.
Getting to Castellano directly would be very difficult. His home in Staten Island was a fortress, under constant supervision by armed guards. He had also installed a sophisticated alarm system.
Didn't you tell me that?
Agents had no solid evidence to suggest that Castellano conducted criminal business in his home. Without such proof, a court would never authorize an FBI bug or a phone wiretap inside the home. Agents hit the streets. They hoped to find one weak link to exploit, one person in the family who made himself vulnerable to electronic surveillance. They learned through informants about a Gambino family crew headed by John Gotti that operated in Queens, headquartered in a private social club called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. A few of the FBI's well-placed informants were close to one of Gotti's lieutenants, a man named Angelo Ruggiero. Though known on the streets as the most vicious gang in the Gambino family, agents believed they found their weak link in Gotti's crew.
And the reason we did was he had a lieutenant named Angelo Ruggiero who ran the day-to-day operations for Gotti and his crew. And Angelo was an attractive target because, number one, he's very active, involved in a lot of criminal activity. Number two, he had a big mouth. He talked a lot. He was a gossip and a blabbermouth.
Mal quickly established surveillance teams to identify, record, and log every person who entered the Bergen Club. Agents learned that John Gotti and his crew made money for the family primarily through hijacking, car thefts, extortion, and illegal gambling operations. Informants told agents that Ruggiero sometimes discussed family business on his daughter's phone. He believed the line listed in her name to be free of FBI bugs. Permission to wiretap a private telephone is granted sparingly. Agents must convince a federal judge that the target is engaged in criminal activities and that the wiretap is likely to produce more evidence. If conversations are not of a criminal nature, the wiretap must be turned off. The informant's statements were enough to convince a federal judge in late 1981 that Ruggiero's daughter's phone should be tapped. Mao's squad had found a way to infiltrate the Gambino family. The wiretapping of Ruggiero's phone proved to be one of the most successful wiretaps in FBI history. The conversations overheard by the FBI were damning. But agents learned that Ruggiero also held meetings in his home with Gambino members. Mao and his squad had enough evidence to justify placing a microphone in Ruggiero's home. Agents slipped in, installed the bugs in his dining room, and left without a trace. The success of the Mafia has always been its ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. What Mao and his squad did not know was that a high-ranking police officer was on the Gambino payroll. Though the mole didn't know specific details, he leaked information to family members about ongoing investigations and electronic surveillance operations. Angelo Ruggiero became paranoid that his house was bugged. He searched the house himself, but found nothing. Unconvinced, he called in a professional to conduct a thorough search or sweep for bugs.
Yeah, I need someone to come sweep my house, please.
Ruggiero ordered the sweep on the tap telephone. When the FBI heard the conversation, they knew they had a crisis.
2345 Richmond Street.
Got a problem.
The phone tap inside the home was immediately turned off to avoid detection.
All that work.
If discovered, it would destroy weeks of diligent work and send the squad back to square one. And there were no targets as talkative as Ruggiero.
Yeah, just come right here. Okay.
The sweeper arrived with the most sophisticated electronic detection equipment available.
Yeah, sounds good.
After 2 days of searching the house top to bottom, he was ready to report his findings to Ruggiero. 2 days after Ruggiero's house was searched for bugs, agents arrested the man who conducted the sweep of his house. What they learned was indeed shocking. He charged Ruggiero thousands of dollars for his services, but none of his detection equipment worked. He had swindled the mob. Fortunately, he had told Ruggiero his house was clean. It was a lucky break for the FBI. Not only had their bugs not been discovered, but now Ruggiero felt confident to speak freely in his house. And he did so with abandon, right into the FBI microphones. Slowly, the FBI was getting closer to the Gambino family hierarchy. To agents, the conversations were a gold mine. As Ruggiero met with his mob partners, the FBI learned of a major heroin trafficking operation conducted by Ruggiero and John Gotti's younger brother, Eugene. Over a 6-month period, Angelo and Eugene Gotti had distributed over 50 kilos of heroin in New York alone. The FBI had every last detail on tape. There was a Mafia rule in effect that dealing drugs was strictly prohibited. The punishment for getting caught was execution. No appeal, no trial. Ruggiero did not have the boss's permission to deal drugs, and he knew the consequences. The government felt it had a strong case against Ruggiero and Eugene Gotti. In September of 1983, they were charged with running a major heroin distribution network and obstruction of justice. Though all of those indicted were part of John Gotti's crew, His name was not mentioned in the taped conversations. But with the indictment, Castellano would soon find out that Gotti's men were dealing drugs. Learning of the heroin operation, however, was not the only valuable piece of information learned by agents. Just prior to his heroin indictment, Ruggiero would meet with other soldiers and discuss how he and John Gotti would go to Paul Castellano's house every Sunday for a family meeting.
And then Angelo would give him a blow-by-blow what happened in Paul's house. The Pope did this, the Pope did that, he's mad at this guy. Everything's going in the family, we found out through Angelo's big mouth. And then next day, other soldiers would come over. Of course, Angelo had to reconstruct what happened again. So we found everything was happening in the Gambino family, thanks to Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti, and Paul Castellano.
Based on the Ruggiero wire, agents now had probable cause to bug the house of Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Getting into Castellano's house took detailed planning and methodical execution. Agents managed to get inside the house and place the bugs. Soon after, they began taping conversations that directly implicated Paul Castellano as the boss of the Gambino family, the man who oversaw a multitude of illegal rackets that cost taxpayers millions of dollars each year. Castellano would meet with his most trusted captains to discuss business. The FBI identified one of those captains as Sammy the Bull Gravano. As his nickname implied, the Bull was both strong and aggressive. He was a boxer and a bodybuilder. He was also the family's top enforcer. Gravano generated his money for the family in the construction industry. He was adept at a number of criminal activities, but his most notorious skill was murder. As the FBI continued to investigate powerful captains in the family like John Gotti and Sammy the Bull, their sights remained focused on the boss. In 1985, 2 years after Ruggiero was indicted, Paul Castellano was arrested and charged along with other New York family bosses with dozens of federal racketeering and conspiracy violations. Out on bail, Castellano continued to run the family, though his attention seemed focused on how to beat the government's case against him. John Gotti was also facing his own legal troubles. An independent investigation led by the U.S. Attorney's Office ended with Gotti and his mentor, underboss Neil Della Croce, being charged with several counts of racketeering. Della Croce and Gotti were released on bail, allowing them to continue their criminal operations. Months later, Della Croce lay dying of cancer. The FBI had bugged his bedroom. Gotti and Ruggiero visited, and the FBI was listening. They recorded Gotti talking about his fears that Castellano might kill him and Ruggiero for getting caught on tape discussing their drug dealings and for leading the FBI to Castellano's house. The boss wanted to hear the FBI tapes. Della Croce promised Gotti that he would do anything in his power to protect him. Della Croce's loyalty to Gotti was causing a rift in the family. He was stalling the boss, reluctant to turn the tapes over to Castellano. The Gambino family was splitting in two. Then, in early December of 1985, Neil Della Croce, the Gambino family's second in command, died of cancer in his home. On December 16th, 2 weeks after Della Croce's death, Castellano and his new underboss, Tommy Bellano, pulled up to a fashionable steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan to meet some associates for dinner. As they started to exit the car, several men approached them and began firing. Castellano and Bellotti never knew what hit them. They were killed instantly. When the boss of a family is assassinated, the FBI believes that the person responsible is usually the one who steps up and assumes leadership of the family. It was Mafia tradition to pay tribute to a new boss, to show him respect. 2 weeks after the murder, agents watched a parade of high-level Gambino family members enter the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. They were meeting with John Gotti. Agent Mao and his squad would have to restructure their attack on the Gambino hierarchy. John Gotti was the new boss of the family. Agents pieced together his criminal history and traced his rise to power. John Gotti became a Gambino family associate around 1970. He impressed the boss in 1973 by killing a man who had kidnapped and murdered a relative of Carlos Gambino. Gotti served 2 years for the hit before he was paroled. Upon his release, he quickly gained respect within the family. He began to make a great deal of money for the family through loan sharking and gambling operations. In his neighborhood, he became a hero of sorts, throwing huge 4th of July parties every year, complete with fireworks. Special Agent George Gabriel was assigned to Mao's squad in 1985. He quickly became an expert on John Gotti.
He took care of if there were old ladies that were in need. If he had money in his pocket, he'd give it out. He was, in some respects, a Robin Hood in his neighborhood. And that's how he carried himself. But how did he make that money? By killing, by robbing, by manipulating, by bribing, by controlling rackets that he didn't have a right to control. And that's the side, when he didn't like you, when you fell on the wrong side of John, you died. I mean, there was no mercy. You died. There was no two ways about it.
Gotti was now the king. He found himself in command of a multi-million-dollar crime network made up of scams he did not know existed. He had a lot to learn. With their bugs and surveillance, Special Agent Gabriel and the rest of the FBI squad learned right along with him.
John Gotti took over that family. He had to learn what the rackets were, and as he's learning them, we're learning them. Who's got what industries, who's collecting from what unions. He's asking captains to give him a list of all the soldiers in there and their crews, so he could know who he's got in his family and how many.
Gotti was the boss, but he still had legal troubles. 6 months after becoming the head of the family, he was sent to jail to await trial on loan sharking and gambling charges. Jail didn't slow him down, though. From his cell, Gotti ordered a murder. It was against Robert DiBernardo, who had been a close associate of Gotti. DiBernardo's assassination was set up by Angelo Ruggiero, who was still awaiting trial for his 1983 drug indictment.
Angelo's one of the few guys who's got access to John in jail and tells him that Robert DiBernardo is talking subversive behind John's back, the boss's back. He's saying that John isn't fit as the boss and we should appoint somebody else as the boss. Angelo wants this done because Angelo owes Robert DiBernardo a lot of money and he doesn't want to pay him back.
I was going over some of these contracts here. This public housing contract.
On Gotti's behalf, Ruggiero asked Sammy the Bull Gravano to set up the hit.
You want some coffee?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Give me some coffee, will you?
On June 5th, 1986, DiBernardo showed up for a meeting at Gravano's construction office. Everyone greeted him as usual. DiBernardo must have suspected nothing.
You know, we got all those contracts.
He was shot in the head from behind. His body was never found. The FBI learned of his death through informants. Agents believed Gotti's crew was responsible for the murder, but they needed proof. In August of '96, 2 months after the DiBernardo hit, Gotti went to trial for the gambling and loan sharking charges filed 2 years before. But Gotti had not been the primary target of that indictment. The case was originally designed to bring down underboss Neil Della Croce. The case against Gotti was never that strong, but an ambitious U.S. attorney saw an opportunity to get a mob boss. Though the case did not involve Mao's squad, he sent George Gabriel to observe the trial. During a break in the proceedings, Gabriel came face to face with his adversary.
I introduced myself. I told him I'm George Gabriel. I'm with the FBI. I work on Bruce Mao's squad. He says, you tell him I'm going to be home in 6 weeks. I'm going to beat this one. I said, all right, I'll deliver your message. I said, and if you do, I'll be there to congratulate you because it'll be a good job on your part. He says, good, I hope to see you.
On March 13th, 1987, Gotti was acquitted on all counts. George Gabriel made good on his promise. After the verdict, Gabriel went to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, where Gotti was having an acquittal party. He congratulated Gotti. To the press, the public, and to prosecutors, John Gotti seemed untouchable. Out of jail, John Gotti resumed his celebrity status. Around town, he was seen at fine restaurants and glitzy nightclubs, always immaculately dressed. Already he was known as the Dapper Don. Now, with his acquittal, he earned the title of the Teflon Don. Charges slid right off him. To the media, he was glorified as the underdog who took on and beat the government. But now, it was Mao's turn to make a case against Gotti.
I get upset when they glorify a guy like that. To me, he's just a common thug, a criminal. He's a terrorist. He doesn't believe in our government. He doesn't believe in voting, doesn't believe in church, he doesn't believe in family. He's a mass murderer. How can you glorify this guy and make him a role model for your kids? It's very upsetting to me.
In order to make his case against Gotti, Mao had to find out where he was conducting his business. The FBI bugs planted at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club had dried up. Since becoming boss, Gotti wasn't spending as much time there. The squad leaned hard on informants to find out where Gotti held his high-level meetings. It took 8 months, but in early 1988, they finally found Gotti's new headquarters. Gotti turned the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy into his headquarters. It was a symbolic gesture on Gotti's part. The Ravenite was his mentor Neil Della Croce's old club. Here, Gotti would meet with his captains to conduct family business. Agents rented an apartment down the street from the Ravenite. A high-powered camera was installed to record all those who came and went from the club. In February of 1988, the FBI earned court approval to bug the Ravenite. With 30 or 40 people in the room, deciphering conversations was difficult. Cassette tape recordings of white noise were always being played in the club. Hearing conversations through that was impossible. But the FBI had to have John Gotti's orders on tape in order to charge him with running the Gambino family. So far, the bugs in the Ravenite had not produced much evidence. Gotti always suspected he was being listened to by the FBI, and he found clever ways to avoid being overheard.
John Gotti was notorious for going on what we described as a walk talk, where he and the person he had to discuss something secretive. Not all mob business is open to everybody in the mob. There were times where a captain would have to speak with his boss. John Gotti would take that person and they'd go outside. Going outside, they're evading the possibility of a bug.
No matter what agents did, It seemed the mob was anticipating their every move, at times even taunting them.
When I would sit in the van outside the Ravenite, they would bang on every van on the street and whisper, "We know you're in there." You get made all the time, and you try your darndest not to, but it happens. And you just have to stay with it.
John Gotti ordered another hit out of range of the FBI bugs. This time, it was Louis Melito, a Gambino soldier whose loyalty to Gotti was suspect. Gotti felt Melito was a threat to the family administration, since Melito had been a close business associate of Paul Castellano and Tommy Bilotti. Sammy the Bull agreed to oversee the hit. He too had little use for Melito. Sammy felt he was trying to move in on the construction industry. Melito was shot dead under Gravano's supervision, his body removed and never found. The FBI learned of the hit through informant rumors. But again, there was not enough hard evidence on Gotti to arrest him. Gotti was ordering people killed right under the FBI's nose. The cat-and-mouse game intensified, and so did the pressure on the FBI to stop him from ordering more killings. Mao knew he was overlooking something. Gotti must be talking, but the FBI didn't know where. In December 1988, Bruce Mao decided it was time to shut down the wire and regroup.
It was a very frustrating time because we knew we were so close. We had these guys on videotape. We could see them coming and going. We saw the walk talks around the street. We were so close, but yet so far away from achieving our goals.
The bugs were shut down, but the FBI's Gambino squad would not give up. They developed a new informant who told them Gotti would sometimes be in deep conversation with one of his men in the Ravenite. Then abruptly, they would leave the table and go into a hallway behind the club. Usually they were gone for 10 or 15 minutes. The meetings in the hall were no doubt incriminating ones. And in a quiet hallway, FBI bugs could pick up more of the conversations. The squad quickly took advantage of the opportunity. In October of 1989, agents bugged the hall. They recorded Gotti meeting with several Gambino family members there. The bug produced some evidence against Gotti, but not the evidence they needed to put him away for life. Gotti had to be meeting his men in another location within the building. Somewhere where he felt comfortable and safe. In the fall of 1989, agents learned from informants about another location within the building that Gotti frequented. Nettie Sorelli was a widow. Her husband, Michael, had been caretaker of the Ravenite Club. When he died, she remained in the apartment they shared, just 2 floors above the club. It was believed that Gotti used Mrs. Sorelli's apartment to talk about sensitive family business. Getting into Mrs. Sorelli's apartment undetected was going to be a problem. She rarely left. As the FBI's Special Operations Squad tried to figure a way in, agents learned that Mrs. Sorelli would be leaving town for the Thanksgiving holiday. It was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Agents went to work. They sneaked into the apartment in the middle of the night and placed the bugs. On November 30th, 1989, the first conversation taped in Mrs. Sorelli's apartment came over the wires. Crisp and clear, all participants talked freely. They spoke directly, using no code words or sign language like they often did when a bug was suspected. For weeks, agents listened in on the apartment conversations. On December 12, 1989, they got the biggest break they could ever have hoped for. That day, Gotti and his underboss, Frank Locascio, met at the apartment. In a rambling conversation, Gotti left a trail of evidence that would later haunt him. He explained labor union rackets and other crimes. And he talked about ordering the murders of several people. The agents monitoring Gotti that night could barely believe their ears. More shocking to agents was what they heard Gotti say about Sammy Gravano. For over an hour, Gotti went on a verbal rampage about Sammy. He said Gravano was getting greedy, taking too big of a cut from the construction racket profits. He was becoming too active in the family, not respecting Gotti's authority. Gotti suggested that 2 murders that he himself had ordered were because Sammy was trying to protect his own interests. According to Gotti, Sammy had suckered him into murdering DiBernardo and Melito.
It was a very important conversation because during this long diatribe, John confessed to 2 murders. He confessed to ordering the hit on Robert DiBernardo. He confessed to ordering the hit on Louis Melito. Both he claimed that Gravano's urging to have murdered. He also talked about a 3rd guy named Louis DeBono who was going to murder another partner of Sammy's. John detailed also his control of different labor unions. He also detailed how much money he's making from different illegal activities. It was our smoking gun. It was the best tape of the entire electronic surveillance.
After recording a few more conversations, the wire in the apartment was turned off in May of 1990. For Mao's Gambino squad, all the years of patience had finally paid off. They had the best evidence they could imagine, and it was John Gotti himself. Over the next few months, agents put together their case against Gotti. The case against the Gambino family hierarchy, which began a decade earlier, was ready to come to a close. On December 12, 1990, exactly a year after Gotti's fateful conversation, Special Agent George Gabriel and 2 others went to the Ravenite Social Club. Their purpose was to arrest John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank Locascio. Backup officers were close behind, or so Gabriel thought.
When I went into the club to arrest them, they had just ordered coffee. And myself, my partner, and one of the police officers kind of accidentally went into the club ahead of the rest of the arrest team. We were about a minute ahead of everybody. So there we were in the classic, we've got you surrounded, and we're looking behind us, and there was nobody there. There wasn't a problem. Everybody complied with what we asked for. And either John or Sammy asked if they can have their cup of coffee, and I said, yeah, go ahead. We've got plenty of time before we leave.
On his way to be booked, Gotti asked Agent Gabriel what he was charged with. Gabriel ran down the list and told Gotti of the taped conversations, especially in the hallway in the apartment. At that, Gotti fell quiet. At a bail hearing a few days later, the 3 defendants heard excerpts from the FBI's tapes. They played a segment from the December 12th conversation. Sammy Gravano heard Gotti bashing his character.
For the first time in life, John Gotti was embarrassed. He was turning shades of blue and pink and trying to duck under the table. Sammy was turning red. You could tell he was hotter than a firecracker. And they kept looking at each other like, what's going on here? But that tape planted the seeds for the first time in Gravano's mind that he and John Gotti could never coexist, and one had to kill the other if they ever got out of jail.
After hearing the tape, Gravano realized Gotti's defense strategy would be to blame him for the murders. Gravano was being set up as the fall guy. On November 8, 1991, Gravano decided to cooperate with the FBI and tell them everything he knew about the Gambino family. He filled in all of the details that were missing from the recordings about how he and Gotti committed crimes on behalf of the Gambino family and managed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Gravano arranged payoffs to jurors and a high-level police officer who had been supplying Gotti with classified information. Both the jurors and the corrupt officer were indicted and given jail sentences. Gabriel finally learned why Gotti had been able to avoid successful prosecutions.
He's out there in everybody's face. I beat the government. They've got nothing on me. Reality was he bought the jury. Sammy Gravano paid a juror $60,000 to throw that case. And that's how he wins his case.
The question most in need of an answer concerned the Castellano assassination. Through Gravano, the FBI finally learned the truth. The seeds for Castellano's assassination were planted when Angelo Ruggiero and Eugene Gotti were indicted in the heroin distribution ring in 1983. The prohibited operation could no longer be kept quiet from the boss. Castellano learned that the government's case was based on FBI recordings of Ruggiero. Castellano was furious. He wanted to hear the tapes for himself. Events began to snowball.
In 1984, the tapes were finally turned over to the defense. And for the first time, all the co-defendants and defense attorneys had all these tapes of Angelo blabbing about heroin trafficking, meetings at Castellano's house, commission meetings, et cetera, et cetera. So around 1984, Castellano, being the boss of the family, asked Ruggiero for a copy of the tapes.
The tension between Gotti and Castellano was held in check by Della Croce. But when Della Croce died, the barriers were down. A few days after Della Croce's death, Castellano summoned his captains for a meeting. Tommy Bellotti would replace Della Croce as underboss. More ominously, Castellano declared that Gotti's crew would be disbanded, his men absorbed into other crews. Castellano had finally listened to the Ruggiero tapes. They had given the government such a good case that after the trial, there probably wouldn't be much of a Gotti crew anyway. Gotti was furious, and he knew he was a target. There was grumbling among the ranks that Castellano was preoccupied with his legal problems and wasn't paying enough attention to the family. Some members thought he was pocketing too much money for himself, not spreading it around among the soldiers and captains. Gotti began to formulate his takeover. He had Angelo Ruggiero approach 3 of the 4 other Mafia families. He wanted to know if they would look the other way if something were to happen to Castellano. The families said they would not interfere. Gotti carefully picked a few soldiers to help plan the hit. In particular, there was one Gambino member whose support would be crucial if the hit was going to succeed. Ruggiero was sent to ask Sammy Gravano if he would participate in the murder of Castellano. Gravano agreed. He was aware of the growing dissent within the family. He also knew that John Gotti was powerful enough to pull off the murder of the boss. And when the other families agreed to stay out of the way, Sammy knew the smart play was to back Gotti. Gotti put together a team of 5 Gambino family members to plan Castellano's assassination. They called themselves the Fist of 5. Hitting the boss of the Mafia's largest family was a formidable task. The Fist would have to find Castellano away from his loyalists. And they knew that Castellano was under constant law enforcement scrutiny. He must be hit someplace where the FBI was not apt to be following him. Their best opportunity came in mid-December 1985. Castellano had asked 5 of his captains to meet him for dinner at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. But one of the captains was a member of the Fist. The night before the planned hit, the Fist convened at a construction office used by Gravano. Four shooters had been hired, 2 for Castellano and 2 for his driver and underboss, Tommy Bellotti. The murders had been meticulously planned. On December 16th, the team gathered in a park about a mile from Sparks. The 4 shooters dressed alike, in black Russian hats and light-colored trench coats. If seen by witnesses, they were more likely to be remembered for what they wore rather than their faces. The primary shooters were to pair off just outside Sparks. Angelo Ruggiero was one of 4 backups who would block all avenues of escape. Gotti and Gravano would observe from down the street in their parked car, ready to shoot if necessary. If something went wrong, if they missed on the street, they were to move into Sparks, firing until Castellano and Bellotti were killed. No matter who got in the way, Castellano and Bellotti had to die. It was dusk when Gotti and Gravano headed towards Sparks Steakhouse. The shooters took their places. Gotti and Gravano soon found their vantage point, a parking space at an intersection down the street from the restaurant. They waited in the car. Castellano was late. Perhaps he'd been tipped off about the plot on his life. In the middle of a conversation with Gotti, Gravano suddenly looked to his left and panicked at what he saw. It was a black Lincoln with Bellotti at the wheel and Castellano beside him. For one moment, Gravano and Gotti thought they would be seen. But the light changed and the car moved on. Gravano radioed ahead. It was time. As Bellotti pulled the car to the curb, the assassins advanced. Paul Castellano and Tommy Bellotti lay outside the car, each shot by 6 bullets. According to Gravano, Gotti eased the car into the street and passed the bodies sprawled on the pavement. He had to be sure Castellano was dead. Gravano's detailed account finally put an end to the speculating. As part of his plea bargain, Gravano testified against his former boss. He admitted to his role in 19 mob-related murders. He served 5 years in prison and voluntarily entered the Witness Protection Program. On April 2nd, 1992, John Gotti was convicted of 5 murders, including Paul Castellano's and Tommy Bellotti's. He also was found guilty of other crimes under the umbrella of obstruction of justice and racketeering. They included bribery of a police officer, jury tampering, gambling, bookmaking, tax evasion, and attempted murder. John Gotti lived out his life in federal custody, stripped of his audience, his expensive suits, and his flamboyant style. He died in a prison hospital on June 10th, 2002. The FBI crackdown on organized crime is working. Louis Scalero, head of the New York office, is optimistic about New York's future.
People today, I think, can build a building in New York City without being shaken down by a Cosa Nostra family. I think a restaurant in New York City could have their garbage picked up without fearing that they will be shaken down if they don't pick a particular carter. People today can compete on the Fulton Fish Market without the necessity of paying off one of the particular New York crime families. So we've come a long way. There is certainly a lot of things that left to be done, but I think people generally in New York City certainly are starting to feel the effects of this effort.
The battle rages on in New York City. Mafia families continue to plunder, continue to kill. But because of the ceaseless efforts of the FBI, the people of New York are beginning to feel relief as more and more mobsters like John Gotti are taken off the streets. For 30 years, Vincent Gigante wandered the streets of New York's Greenwich Village, dressed in a tattered bathrobe and babbling endlessly to himself. To the FBI, he was believed to be the boss of New York's most powerful mafia organization, the Genovese crime family. Was Gigante crazy, or was his behavior a shrewd attempt to disguise his position as a ruthless mafia boss? That question would take years to answer.
Every family has eccentrics, even crime families. Crime boss Vincent Gigante, head of New York's Genovese family, was undoubtedly eccentric. The question remained, was he truly mad? Justice rested on the answer. Outwardly, he roamed the streets as a doggedly old man, barely in touch with reality. But in the eyes of the law, he was a cunning conspirator and responsible for murder. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Organized crime takes a concerted effort to crack. The FBI is devoted to cracking it. The case against Gigante hinged on his ability to stand trial. Was his strange behavior an act of madness or a stroke of genius?
Anyone who witnessed Gigante's ravings would have found it hard to believe that he controlled the largest and most profitable family in the New York Mafia, an organization with a long and bloody history. The origins of the Mafia can be traced back to 13th century feudal Sicilian society. Bands of Sicilian families organized themselves to rebel against the oppressive and ruthless French invaders. Mafia, the acronym for the Italian Morta alla Francia Italia Anella, which translates to death to the French is Italy's cry, became the name that these organized families used to refer to themselves, its meaning synonymous with men of honor. By the 19th century, the Mafia re-emerged in Sicily as a purely criminal culture, mostly hiring themselves out to wealthy landowners to oppress upstart peasants. More and more, the goal of the Mafia became focused on how to generate illegal profits. The tradition continued as waves of Italians emigrated to New York in the 1920s. Most immigrants lived in cramped and poor conditions. As a result of growing ethnic tensions, Sicilian Americans became the target of growing resentment. They needed Mafia protection more and more. Louis Scalero, a third-generation Italian-American, is head of the FBI's New York field office. A 23-year veteran, he is an expert on the Mafia and its intricate structure.
When they first became prevalent in New York City, it primarily victimized members of the immigrant community, where in lower Manhattan they became the victims of extortions and protection rackets. And that's how the Cosa Nostra families originally got their start.
With Prohibition, influence of the crime families grew out from the isolated neighborhoods and began to spread nationwide. A new form of underworld cooperation emerged. Various crime families across America banded together to supply illegal alcohol to a country willing to pay for it.
I think that probably more than anything gave the Italian gangs, the Italian Cosa Nostra families, a foothold in American society, not only from an organizational standpoint, but certainly from a financial base. Since Prohibition, certainly they then expanded into other areas.
Operating outside the law meant the Mafia had to police itself. For an organization animated by self-interest and greed, there would always be conflict and opposition. An elite group of killers were organized to enforce Mafia rules, thereby ensuring its survival. This group of mob enforcers came to be known as Murder, Inc. By the early 1940s, Murder, Inc. would be responsible for hundreds of mob-related murders nationwide. The powerful New York bosses during the Mafia's early years, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, set up a ruling body for the Mafia, responsible for delegating territories and duties among the various gangs nationwide. Home for America's 5 largest families, New York remained the center of the Mafia's expanding foothold in America. It remains so to this day.
The 5 New York families consist currently of the Gambino family, the Bonanno, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and the Genovese family. Each of those families are also members of the Commission and also have their base in New York City.
The Commission, composed of the bosses of the 5 New York families, acts as a criminal board of directors, settling disputes between families and making major decisions on Mafia business. Each family is governed by its administration, comprised of the boss, the underboss, and the consigliere, or counselor, who are responsible for directing their family's criminal activity. Below the administration in the family hierarchy are the captains. The captains are the leaders of crews of soldiers, the men responsible for carrying out the day-to-day criminal activity. To become a soldier, properly known as a wise guy or good fella, an individual has to first be made or officially inducted into the secret society. He must blindly obey the rules of Cosa Nostra, Italian for this thing of ours. He is sworn to put the family ahead of all else. If he is asked to kill, he must faithfully do so. It was against this backdrop, a bustling immigrant community with an expanding Cosa Nostra influence, that Vincent Giganti grew up. His parents came from Naples and settled in Lower Manhattan. Vincent finished 8th grade and started trade school, but soon dropped out. Less than a decade later, Giganti became a wise guy in the Genovese crime family. Vincent Giganti's crime career spanned a turbulent time in American Mafia history. The mob had expanded its reach into legitimate businesses, the various families fighting to control them. And in the ensuing turf wars, violence was often the final arbiter. The family that Giganti attached himself to was steeped in Cosa Nostra's American origins. The infamous Charles Lucky Luciano, responsible for organizing and structuring the American Mafia, was the family's first boss until he was imprisoned in 1936. As a result, Luciano's family administration, Frank Costello, nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and Vito Genovese, fought for control of the family. Costello won out, but Vito Genovese began plotting his takeover. A young Vincent Giganti first gained notoriety as a mobster in 1957 when he attempted to murder Frank Costello. Within the Mafia, it was widely believed that Vito Genovese had ordered the hit to get rid of his rival. Giganti's bullet only grazed Costello's head, but apparently Costello got the message. Soon after the shooting, he put out word that he was retiring. Vito Genovese was now the boss of the family that would take his name. Giganti was arrested for attempted murder and brought to trial, but the case was dismissed for lack of a witness. The location and angle of Costello's wound indicated he probably saw the would-be assassin, but at the trial, he failed to identify Giganti as the shooter. Even for an ousted boss, the oath of secrecy remained sacred. Gigante continued to make money for the Genovese family through illegal enterprises. 2 years after the failed assassination attempt, he was arrested and convicted of narcotics violations. He received a 7-year sentence. Convicted mobsters are expected to do their time and remain silent. If Gigante served his time and kept his mouth shut, he would be rewarded after his release. It was up to Gigante to figure out how to avoid future arrests. He was a model prisoner, neat, polite, and willing to take on any job. Gigante's cooperation was so impressive that some prison officials wrote glowing reports. He was released early from the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg for good behavior when he was 35 years old. Gigante now devised a secret plan that he hoped would prevent his return to prison forever. He didn't want to leave his Mafia life or give up his shot at becoming the boss of the family. After his release in 1964, Gigante's public behavior began to grow bizarre. He became a frequent sight on the streets of Greenwich Village. Gigante could be found wandering the neighborhood, appearing disoriented and mentally unstable. Not long after he left prison, Gigante learned of a police investigation over his association with known mobsters. In 1969, he was indicted for attempting to bribe New Jersey police officers. Allegedly, he offered them money in exchange for information about surveillance and ongoing investigations in the Genovese family. Now, at almost 40 years old, he returned to his mental disability as a foil and checked himself into a psychiatric hospital for the first time. To support his story, Gigante and his relatives began to revise his medical history. While Gigante was at Lewisburg, his mother had been required to fill out a detailed family history. She said Vincent was a healthy, happy child. She noted only a speech impediment and a slight heart murmur. He had been a boxer, but never had a serious injury. By the time of the 1969 indictment, however, Gigante's lawyers claimed he was not competent to stand trial. His family suddenly remembered a host of mental problems. He had been given to severe temper tantrums. He had a phobia for the dark. He had been truant from school. He was at one time obese and had learning problems. The incompetency argument worked. Gigante never stood trial for the 1969 bribery charges. That same year, Gigante's boss, Vito Genovese, died of heart failure while serving a prison sentence for narcotics trafficking. In the decade that followed, the Genovese family was so secretive that for law enforcement, it was difficult to tell exactly who the boss was. Even had the FBI been able to identify the Genovese family leadership, making a case against them was another story. Witnesses were hard to come by. Mobsters who violated the sacred oath faced certain death. The best the FBI could do was to go after individual crimes. There were no laws that focused on bringing down the entire criminal family. As Gigante was moving up in the family, the federal government was about to make the FBI's job a little easier. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influences and Corrupt Organization Act, better known as the RICO laws.
What the racketeering law allowed us to do was to look at the family as a criminal enterprise and to attack the family as a criminal act. That became much more effective if you look back from the mid-70s to the 80s in terms of actually indicting the entire family and the entire hierarchy of that family.
The RICO laws require that the government prove that Mafia families are essentially criminal enterprises. They must show that the crimes committed by the boss and members of his family are committed to either expand the criminal enterprise or to increase a family member's position within that enterprise. To successfully bring down a family, the government has to prove that any one of several criminal acts, ranging from racketeering and extortion to murder, has been committed. By 1979, now armed with federal legislation aimed directly at organized crime, the FBI had devoted teams to exclusively focus investigations on the 5 major families. The FBI's Genovese squad finally learned that Vincent Gigante was on a fast track with the family. Special Agent Richard Rudolph had been assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family.
Through informants and other law enforcement agencies who were exchanging information, we became aware that Mr. Gigante was an individual with much respect in the Genovese crime family and operated out of an area in Lower Manhattan. Because he was an up-and-coming person with a lot of respect within the family, we began to do some surveillances of Mr. Gigante.
With the FBI continuing to build its arsenal against organized crime, Gigante's cat and mouse game intensified. He stepped up his public show of mental disorder. In the late 70s and into the 80s, he was admitted 5 more times for psychiatric treatment. The FBI continued to keep tabs on Gigante. Agents learned that he frequented the Triangle Social Club, a gathering place for Genovese crime figures.
He could be found there almost on a daily basis. He lived in the neighborhood. He was an individual that could be found there in the late afternoons and into the early hours of the morning, and people would come to see him as opposed to him going to see other people.
Though Gigante's association in the Genovese family seemed certain to investigators, Gigante's family and doctors continuously told investigators that he led a very narrow existence. They said his whole world was confined to the block where he lived and the church he attended with his mother. He was barely functional at home and could not care for himself, they said. But with every passing day, the FBI and New York police were seeing a very different Vincent Gigante. In the early 1980s, the Mafia in the Northeast went through a particularly tumultuous time with several killings. Internal disputes within the family resulted in a string of assassinations. The FBI suspected Gigante was responsible for these gangland executions, especially those intended as punishment for breaking Cosa Nostra rules. Gigante was known to be a traditionalist. He wanted the rules obeyed, and when they were broken, retribution was sure to follow. It started with the murder of Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno. Although Bruno's family was well outside New York, all families answered to the members of the commission. Gigante was upset because Bruno had been assassinated by his own men in a grab for control of the family. A Cosa Nostra rule had been violated. No one can kill a boss unless the commission sanctions it, and they seldom do. It was rumored that Gigante himself launched an investigation into Bruno's murder. Retribution was swift. Less than a month later, Tony Bananas Caponegro, identified as one of Bruno's assassins, was found dead. He had been shot 15 times and stabbed in the back. His body was stuffed in a trunk, and $20 bills were littered around his body, a clear message that he was killed for his greed. On the same day, another body was discovered. This time it was Fred Salerno, dead of gunshot wounds, dumped in a vacant lot. He too had allegedly participated in Bruno's murder. Phil Testa had taken Angelo Bruno's place as boss. His reign was short. Almost a year after Bruno's execution, Testa was blown up entering his own home. Another boss killed without the blessing of the commission. Another avenging act would follow. Rocco Marinucci was next, found dead with fireworks stuffed in his mouth. A gesture designed to show that he was killed for the way in which he had killed Testa. If the Cosa Nostra was to flourish, all of its members had to comply with its rules. There were no exceptions. Gigante was believed to have ordered the murder of one of his own crime family members. Genovese soldier Jerry Papa had murdered 2 Colombo family members without permission. As punishment for his unsanctioned act, he was brutally shot and killed by members of his own criminal family. Had Gigante become the enforcer for the Northeast Cosa Nostra? Informers within the mob told federal agents that all of these killings had been ordered by Gigante. But information given by admitted criminals is always a problem for potential juries. Criminals will say anything if their cooperation can be traded for a reduced prison sentence. The FBI needed more than the words of criminals looking for a deal. Gigante knew this, and he protected himself accordingly. It seemed that Gigante was now the boss. The FBI began a more focused surveillance effort on Gigante. They learned that the Genovese family had also infiltrated several of New York's major industries: the garment trade, trucking, garbage collection, airport cargo handling, and the city's seafood industry. Vincent Gigante was known on the streets as the Chin, an abbreviation of Cinzino, Little Vincent. Fearing FBI surveillance and wiretaps, family members were not allowed to speak his name. They were to refer to him with hand signals, touching their chins to communicate his nickname. Bringing down the Chin was going to take every bit of know-how that the FBI could muster. They were going to have to create their own luck. As a surveillance team member watched one day, a telling crack in the Chin's ruse appeared. The seemingly frail man was being helped across a busy street. When oncoming traffic threatened, he became suddenly animated, racing to safety. His helplessness somehow overtook him again on the other side. Clearly, there were 2 Gigantes, the mentally troubled one displayed to the public, and the determined boss of the Genovese administration. The FBI would soon learn of a third. Gigante's ex-wife and their 5 children lived in New Jersey while he maintained a relationship with his long-standing companion, Olympia Esposito. He usually called on her late at night, looking quite dapper before he was aware of the surveillance.
We learned that he frequently visited a townhouse which was located up on 77th Street and the east side of Manhattan, where we later learned that a common law, he was living with his common law wife, and he had been married previously, and this was his second family there at this residence.
Soon the FBI knew all of the Chin's hangouts. This gave surveillance teams an opportunity to observe Gigante without his knowledge. A major break came when NYPD Organized Crime Task Force member Detective Tom Bruno was able to snap photos of some of Gigante's activities.
In 1984, I was assigned to a joint organized crime task force. That task force consisted of FBI agents and New York City police officers, detectives, and we were assigned to investigate the Genovese crime family. Then next step was to go to Sullivan Street where Chin Gigante lived. His apartment was above a pet store, alleged pet store. And he also had a social club on the block. And when you'd go by the social club, you'd see numerous people that were in the photos. And you'd see them standing in front of, going inside, and then sometimes crossing the street, going to the pet store, which was where the Chin, we believe, met people. Pet store really never had any kind of business that we could see. It had a little cat box in the window, and basically that was it.
More and more, Gigante was seen acting normally when he was unaware he was being watched.
I see Chin Gigante and I see Andrew Gigante, which is his son, come out of his residence. And I'm just minding my business, walking up the block. Andrew leaves to get in his car, and Chin is standing on the corner, and he wasn't helped out of his building, and he was standing on the corner. Andrew gets in his car, pulls out. As he pulls out, there's a car coming up Sullivan Street. It blows the horn. Chin Gigante yells, "Hey, what are you, in a rush?" As he does this, I come into the lighted area. He looks, sees me, and all of a sudden his head goes down, and he plays the sick point.
Another break followed Detective Bruno's surveillance successes. The FBI managed to rent an apartment close to the townhouse of Gigante's companion, Ms. Esposito. An agent would exit through a back door in the rented apartment building and position himself about 50 feet from Ms. Esposito's townhouse. From there, Miss Esposito and Gigante could be seen from time to time. An agent watched the couple for 4 months between midnight and 2 a.m. Assistant U.S. Attorney Andrew Weissman, who later would have to prove Gigante's competency to stand trial, was delighted with the agent's observations.
And lo and behold, when he was inside in a place where he didn't think he was being observed, he did all of the normal things that any of us would do. As a matter of fact, what was unusual about those surveillances was that there was nothing unusual about him. He was normal. He was talking to people. He was counting money. He never wore a shoddy bathrobe. Indeed, the only time he was seen in a bathrobe was, not surprisingly, when he got out of the shower. He would wear a nice, fluffy, Brooks Brothers type bathrobe, which was not at all like the bathrobe that he would wear when he was on the street. So it became pretty obvious to the people conducting the surveillance that he was engaging in a concerted effort to give an appearance to the public that was false, that was not the way he behaved in real life.
Investigators continued to watch Gigante's bizarre public behavior. But photos themselves are only a single link in proving criminal activity. Investigators needed hard evidence to corroborate what the photos were suggesting, that Gigante was in fact the boss. One wiretap conversation between Genevieve's crew members gave investigators more proof of Gigante's position in the family. On the tapes, known Genovese members were complaining about the Chin. Assistant U.S. Attorney George Stamboulidis reviewed these tapes to help prepare a case against Gigante.
He's constantly nitpicking his men, trying to always, with a million questions, drilling them and questioning them on what they're involved in. He's always looking to get money from them, or money from some of the schemes and how he earned, and how much money he would make from the gambling operations at the Triangle Social Club and things like that.
While Gigante micromanaged the internal affairs of his family, the tabloids began calling him the Odd Father.
He would check himself into a hospital once a year for what his colleagues in the Mafia sarcastically referred to as tune-ups, so that he would have a paper trail showing that he had some, or giving the impression that he had some mental condition. And with the assistance of people around him, and people in his family, he was able to cultivate this paper trail, giving the impression to anyone who looked at the cold medical records that here's someone who, year in, year out, was being treated for some form of mental illness.
Gigante knew how to protect himself, both publicly and privately.
Mr. Gigante was very clever in how he conducted business, and he limited his contacts with members of the family. If there were messages or items to be discussed regarding illegal activities conducted by the Genovese family, there would be messages passed on to people immediately surrounding him. Access to him was very limited. If the other family wanted to meet with him, more than likely they would have to send a message.
Gigante avoided the normal sit-downs or more formal meetings held regularly by other family bosses. He would take meetings when businesses demanded his attention. He and his visitors would stroll the sidewalks through the neighborhood, ensuring that surveillance wiretaps would not pick up any incriminating conversations. The always careful Gigante also suspected Ms. Esposito's phone was tapped, and it was. He never talked business on the phone. He would simply use a payphone or make arrangements to talk elsewhere. The FBI would not be able to use the Chin's own words to make a case against him. Other mobsters were not as smart. Sophisticated bugging operations were allowing the FBI to capture a multitude of other mob business on tape. In early 1985, the Justice Department was bearing down hard on a number of high-level organized crime figures. Most were being charged under the RICO Act. Though RICO had been around since the early 70s, it was only now receiving its first real test. Two of Gigante's men had gotten wind that the bosses of the Gambino and Lucchese families would soon be arrested. They wondered if the Chin was vulnerable. One commented that if he gets pinched, all those years in the asylum would be for nothing. On February 19th, the arrests of several crime family bosses were made. The next day, Vincent Gigante checked himself into the hospital and stayed a week. He had successfully avoided the indictment against the New York bosses. Among those arrested was Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino crime family. Prosecutors never brought him to trial. He was killed before they had the chance. By Cosa Nostra standards, the unsanctioned murders of Gambino boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti were unpardonable. Although John Gotti, a captain in the Gambino family, acted shocked at Castellano's death, it was widely believed that he was responsible. Within 2 weeks of the murders, Gotti had publicly taken over as boss. Vincent Gigante issued a subtle warning to Gotti. Without mentioning names, he told Gotti that the murderer would have to pay. It took 2 years, but in 1987, Gigante acted to avenge the murder of his friend and partner in mob business. Through his counselor, Bobby Manna, and some Lucchese family members, Gigante plotted to have Gotti killed. The planning session at a New Jersey restaurant was bugged, and because it was, the FBI saved John Gotti's life. If agents intercept information of a murder plot, they are required by law to try to prevent the killing. So based on the tape, agents warned Gotti. Acting on the FBI warning, John Gotti changed his plans on the day the murder was to take place. Because he was not where he was expected, the murder plot failed. Gigante, however, did not give up. He asked Vic Amuso, acting boss of the Lucchese family, to supervise another hit. It was up to Amuso and his men to work out the details.
And that was to have Amuso reach out to Al Diorco, one of his trusted men, just as Manna was one of Giganti's trusted men, and have D'Arco use his contacts in other parts of the country to acquire a remote-controlled bomb.
But Gotti was arrested and imprisoned before the second plot could be carried out. He died of cancer while serving a life sentence for racketeering involving extortion and murder, including Castellanos. Meanwhile, the FBI had Chin's men on tape conspiring the murder. As the FBI's investigation into Genovese family operations continued, information about a corrupt construction scheme was coming to light. They learned that for years, much of the Genovese family income came from one segment of the construction industry, the window business. The family had managed to keep its hold on window replacement jobs for all of New York City's public housing projects.
We learned that at that time there was an enormous amount of money being put into refurbishing some of the New York City Housing Authority windows. There was an energy crisis underway, and the timing of this was ideal for the organized crime people to become more active in it. What we learned was that the Genovese family, along with 2 or 3 other families, were becoming involved in companies that were bidding and installing the windows in some of these housing projects. From the late 1970s up until the late 1980s, there was approximately $190 million worth of contracts given out by the city of New York for the window replacement industry.
It was classic mob business and a textbook example of racketeering. The Mafia took over an industry to the exclusion of legitimate businesses. Union officials were corrupted. In this case, Ironworkers Local 580. Bids were rigged, and companies or workers trying to play by the rules lost out. For years, the Lucchese and Genovese families operated their construction schemes autonomously. By the early 80s, they realized that a partnership would be much more profitable. By this time, the Lucchese family had a firm hold on Local 580, and the Genovese family had corrupted several contractors. They cooperated because it meant more business.
By using the Local 580 as a tool, they were able to exclude several contractors from coming in and bidding on some of these projects, and in essence created a somewhat of a monopoly for themselves.
On nearly all city housing authority work, and on much of the new construction for the city, the Genovese contractors and installers paid $2 a window. $1 went to the Lucchese family, 25 cents to the collector, and 75 cents to the boss for the family's role in handling the union. The other $1 went to the crooked union officials who looked the other way as jobs went to non-union workers. Refusal to cooperate often carried a penalty of violence. In the late 80s, a carpenters union delegate had both of his legs broken by Genovese men for refusing to cooperate, though he maintained that he was unable to get a good look at his attackers. And in 1992, a delegate from Local 580 was shot and killed coming out of his house on Long Island over a disagreement with his Cosa Nostra contracts. The Lucchese and Genovese family arrangement was working very smoothly. That is, until Peter Savino was persuaded to wear a wire. Savino was a Genovese soldier and point man for the window racket.
We built a case on him, a murder case on him, and it was sufficiently compelling that he realized, like many of these people, that he didn't want to die in jail. So what did he do? He decided to cooperate. And for an 18-month period, made tape recordings of people in the Genovese family and people in the Lucchese family operating this scheme.
Vincent Giganti didn't realize Peter Savino was turning on him. He was happy with Savino's work and satisfied with the window scheme's progression. Savino kept track of the money. He managed the contracts. He supervised the bids. He arranged the payoffs. The boss was happy, but some Genovese family members began to suspect Savino. When bodies were found in the basement of a building he owned, Genovese members were surprised that he was never seriously investigated by law enforcement.
As a result of that, people speculated, well, Savino wasn't arrested, yet these bodies were found in a building that's tied to him. Maybe he's cooperating, but nobody was really sure.
Savino was a cash cow for Vincent Gigante. He was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Genovese family every month. So when Gigante was told of Savino's betrayal, he chose not to believe it and initially refused to order him killed. Savino continued to wear the wire, trying to get other family members to acknowledge Chin and his position as boss of the family. Gigante's troops, however, could never be persuaded to break the boss's rule about not mentioning his name.
Remember Uniseal? Vincent had said when it came time to bid. Oh, okay, I'll mention him. He had said to go out and bid the work.
It was, don't mention that name. How can you talk like that? That was pretty damning proof. Even though it didn't give you a specific crime, it told you that this was a man to be feared. It was hardly somebody who was incompetent.
Shortly thereafter, it came to Gigante's attention that Savino was in fact cooperating. Furious at this betrayal, Gigante ordered the murder of Peter Savino. By that time, the FBI had relocated Savino well out of Genovese family reach, but not before he supplied agents with thousands of hours of taped conversations.
Mr. Savino was also in a position to provide us with the historical aspects of how this scheme developed, his relationship with the leaders of both the Lucchese and Genovese crime family, and what their participation was in this thing. Mr. Savino also was able to tell us how the various members of all of these families interacted with Local 580, which was used, again, as the tool to make the scheme work.
The FBI was successfully employing the RICO laws to bring down New York's most powerful bosses. As a result, high-ranking family members saw that their only way to avoid long prison terms was to cooperate. Among them were Gambino family underboss Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gigante was finally arrested and charged under the RICO laws with ordering 6 people murdered, conspiring to kill 3 others, and at least 24 counts of racketeering. In short, Gigante was charged with being the boss of the Genovese crime family. But Gigante still had his mental illness history to fall back on.
Mr. Gigante was indicted in May of 1990, and his second indictment was filed against him in June of 1993. The case against Mr. Gigante was unusual, that it spanned several years before it actually went to trial. He eventually went to trial in June of 1997. During that period of time, the issue that was before the courts was that whether he was competent to stand trial or not. That issue was finally resolved in 1996.
7 years after his arrest, a federal district judge declared Vincent Gigante competent to stand trial. Vincent the Chin Gigante was 69 years old when a jury convicted him of conspiring to kill 3 Mafia figures, including Gotti and Savino. He was also found guilty of extortion and union payoff conspiracies in the window replacement scheme. But jurors failed to convict him on charges of directly ordering 6 murders. Now that Gigante was convicted, his defense lawyers argued that he was not fit to be sentenced. They claimed he was too old, too frail, and too mentally incompetent to understand the punishment. While awaiting sentencing, Gigante was confined to a prison hospital and examined by several doctors. Gigante was given several PET scans, a procedure that uses a radioactive tracer to measure brain chemistry. A 1991 scan, first read as normal, was later found to be too flawed to use in diagnosis. A 1993 scan did show some abnormalities. But at least one expert, Dr. Jonathan Brody, judged these abnormalities as not consistent with dementia. Dr. Brody is an attending psychiatrist at New York's Bellevue Hospital and a professor at New York University's School of Medicine. He also conducts research on schizophrenia.
Mr. Gigante, at the time of the scan, was purportedly taking medication that affects the brain. And because it affects the brain, it affects brain chemistry. And brain chemistry is what a PET scan is all about.
Gigante was taking an antipsychotic medication, and antidepressants, a low-potency tranquilizer, and sleeping pills. So Dr. Brody was skeptical about the PET scan, but had yet to examine the patient.
When the three of us entered the observation room, the examining room where he was then brought, I was struck at first by his appearance, which I said made me think, oh my God, he really is sick. I've missed the boat. He's really very sick. He came in wearing a bathrobe, he was shuffling, he was mumbling, he was making allusions to God.
But as the examination progressed, some of Gigante's actions began to raise doubts.
But one of the things that really struck me was that I didn't note at the time, but I noted a few seconds later, was when I put out my hand for him to shake it, he didn't shake it. And that's a very automatic behavior. You put your hand out, your worst enemy can put his hand out to you, and you tend to take it.
How about this way?
When Gigante was asked the names of his children, he didn't know. When he was asked where he lived, he didn't know.
And yet, these are things that people tend not to forget. You know, the brain in a dementia tends to work on the process of accounting. The last in, first out. So recent memory tends to be lost, but that's why people who are very demented can often remember very well events from long ago, even if they can't remember recent events. Well, he was not consistent on that. Indeed, he was asked the question about who the President of the United States was, which is a standard question on a psychiatric mental status evaluation. And he scratched his head and he looked perplexed and he said, I should know that. I should know that answer. It's in there somewhere. And some more questions were asked. He said, I really should know that. And then finally he said, Bush. George Bush. And I sat there and thought, oh, he remembered the question. What was striking was not that the answer was incorrect. What was striking was that the question was remembered despite all of the interfering questions.
And there were other red flags. He seemed to understand abstract concepts. Dr. Brody asked Gigante if he was proud of his children.
Now, pride is really quite an abstract notion. And his response was, yes, they're all working. Legitimate jobs. Legitimacy? Well, that wasn't even a question. Legitimate implies yet something else, that he was able to abstract from the question some intent as to what the question was involved with, and awareness of a distinction between legitimacy and illegitimacy. And here was a man who didn't know what month it was. He didn't know if he was in a hospital.
These and other inconsistencies contributed to Dr. Brody's conclusion that Gigante did not suffer from progressive dementia, vascular dementia, or schizophrenia. Guards assigned to watch Gigante during his pre-sentencing hospitalization also found his behavior normal. They testified that he was active around his prison hospital cell and polite to the hospital staff. He did not need help to shower, to groom himself, or to feed himself.
The lawyers all put in affidavits that they couldn't communicate with Vincent Gigante at all. Well, when he was in jail, he managed to speak with the prison counselors. When you sort of talk to the sort of low-level people in jail who have to take care of inmates on a day-to-day basis, it turns out he knew exactly what had happened. He knew he had been on trial. He knew that Gravano had testified against him and didn't have very nice things to say about him. He knew that his sentencing was upcoming. He knew what the issue was before Judge Weinstein as to that he had to decide that he was competent to be sentenced. It was completely at odds with what his lawyers were telling Judge Weinstein.
Some psychiatrists thought Gigante really was incompetent. Others thought he was faking. 5 months and dozens of tests later, the judge ruled. The judge said, "In short, the defendant's cognitive and emotional capacity and his communication skills are equivalent to other 69-year-old defendants with limited education. No hallucinations interfere with his abilities to participate in sentencing. He understands the fundamentals of criminal substantive law and procedure. He is deliberately feigning mental illness to avoid punishment which he fears. Defendant is competent to be sentenced and to serve an appropriate term in prison." Shaliro described efforts of the FBI and prosecutors as historic and courageous.
This has been a battle that certainly I've been involved with for the last 20 years, and certainly I think agents that will continue that on over the next 5 or 6 years. If the effort could be sustained and the resources maintained, I think we're on the verge of really reducing the effects and the impact of the Cosa Nostra.
To be sure, the government's legal victory in the Gigante case was partial. The jury, after all, failed to convict him of the 6 murder charges. He was originally sentenced to 12 years. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and earned 3 more years, finally admitting in court that he had been faking insanity the entire time.